Welcome to my channel, Reading Radical Feminism. This video is part 2 of the introduction to Gynecology by Mary Daly.
The Silencing of Women and Silent Spring. This is an extremist book written in a situation of extremity, written on the edge of a culture that is killing itself and all of sentient life. The tree of life has been replaced by the necrophilic symbol of a dead body hanging on dead wood. The Godfather insatiably demands more sacrifices, and the fundamental sacrifices of pseudo-spiritual religion are female. The sacrificing of women requires the silencing of women, which takes place in myriad ways, in a maze of ways. A basic pattern of these ways is self-splitting, which is initiated by the patriarchally powerful, and which the victims internalize and continue to practice within the caste of women. Women are silenced/split by the babble of grammatical usage. Subliminal and subtle self-splitting is achieved by the very pronouns we are trained to use to designate ourselves. Julia Stanley and Susan Robbins have written of the peculiar history of the pronoun she, which was introduced in Middle English as a late development. During the Middle Ages, he had come to be both the female and male pronoun. After she was introduced, it referred only to females, while he became, quote, generic, allegedly including women. This transition in the history of the pronoun he was hardly insignificant. Begin, quote, since the female pronoun always designates females, while the male pronoun designates all humans as well as males, patriarchal language, as manifested in the pronominal system of English, extended the scope of maleness to include humanity, while restricting femaleness to, quote, the other, who is by implication non-human. Any speaker internalizing such a language unconsciously internalizes the values underlying such a system, thus perpetuating the cultural and social assumptions necessary to maintain the patriarchal power structure. End quote. When women become aware of the manipulable ambiguity of the pronoun he, we have perceived only the foreground of grammatical silencing techniques. Just as it would be a mistake to fixate upon the pseudo-generic man and assume that terms such as people and person are, quote, real generics, parentheses, a falsehood disclosed by expressions as, quote, people and their wives, end quote, end parentheses, so it is a mistake to fixate upon the third person singular. As Monique Wittig has shown, the pronoun I conceals the sexual identity of the speaker/writer. The I makes the speaker/writer deceptively feel at home in a male-controlled language. When she uses this pronoun, she may forget that she is buried in the false generic he. The fact is that the female saying I is alien at every moment to her own speaking and writing. She is broken by the fact that she must enter this language in order to speak or write. As the I is broken, so also is the inner I, as in the organ, EYE, the capacity for integrity of knowing/sensing. In this way, the inner voice of the self's integrity is silenced. The external voice babbles in alien and alienating tongues, and when the self tries to speak out of her true depths, the pedantic peddlers of, quote, correct usage and style try to drown it in their babble. Women are silenced/split by the embedding of fears. These contrived and injected fears function in a manner analogous to electrodes implanted in the brain of a victim, quote, patient, who can be managed by remote control. This is a kind of, quote, silent, end quote, control, parentheses, as silent as the pushing of a button, end parentheses. Women may feel that they are free from certain fears, aside liberated, and then bend to the unacknowledged power of these fears with mental knee-jerk responses. A brief analysis of responses to a few of these instilled fears should unmask the methods of, quote, silent control, which silence the voices of women's deep selves while allowing the, quote, liberated false selves to babble freely. For example, the cliche, quote, "she lacks a sense of humor," end quote, applied by men to every threatening woman, is one basic, quote, electrode embedded just deeply enough into the fearful foreground of women's psyches to be able to conduct female energy against the self while remaining disguised. The comment is urbane, insidious. It is boring and predictable if seen through, devastating if believed. The problem is that the victim who, quote, sees through this dirty trick on one level may, quote, believe the judgment literally on more vulnerable levels. It is perfectly consistent with patriarchal patterns that this device is used especially against the wittiest women, who are dismissed as, quote, sharp-tongued. The Godfather is the father of lies and favors the most blatant lies. In the land of the fathers, the more blatant the lie, the greater its credibility, for it is then most consistent with the general pattern of bizarre beliefs. Our ability to overcome the power of such particular fear-instilling lies depends on our ability to discern the pattern of the whole. Ecology requires a constant effort to see the interconnectedness of things. Interconnectedness, not inter. What a way with words. It involves seeing the totality of the lie, which is patriarchy, unweaving its web of deception. Since the totality of the patriarchal lie is not integrity, since it lacks the complexity of real integrity, it tends to fall apart quickly once we see its pattern, once we dare to face, quote, the whole thing, end quote. Moreover, since it depends entirely upon the reality which it distorts and demonically reflects, our seeing through patriarchy is at the same time learning to see the background, our stolen integrity/energy/being. Once we are attuned to the fact of instilled fears and of how they are used to keep women in line, we can detect the patterns over and over again. As we isolate each fear and examine it, we can see that our overcoming it depends upon seeing it in context, seeing through the whole thing. Consider, for example, the fear of becoming like one's mother, matrophobia. Repeatedly, we find daughters who repudiate the particular kind of victimization they see in their mothers' lives, only to live and die out an apparently opposite, but really only slightly variant form of the same disease. For example, the life of a Cosmo girl is opposed to that of a staid suburban housewife. Embedded fears of being labeled, quote, sick, quote, selfish, or, quote, sexless all function in similar ways. If the victim does not see the pattern, she will react to the particulars by becoming mindlessly, quote, normal, murderously, quote, selfless, moronically, quote, sexy. In these various ways, herself is silenced. Fear of the label, quote, lesbian has driven many into matrimony, mental hospitals, and worst of all, dumbing normality. It has driven others into heterosexist, quote, gay pride protests, promoted by and for men, into butch femme matings modeled on matrimony, into aping the genital fixations of porn peddlers, pimps, priests, lesbians/spinsters/Amazons/survivors can defeat the embedded fears only by acknowledging the total context of deception plotted by the male supremacist script writers. Spinning, amazing, surviving is coming out of the shadows into a fullness of light which reduces the, quote, spotlights of the father's fixation to invisibility/impotence. In her own light, the self sees/says her own light/insight. She sees through the lurid male masturbatory fantasies about made-up, quote, lesbians who make out in Playboy for men's amusement. The self expels them together with other embedded, quote, seminal ideas, end quote. Images of the macho female prison guard, the, quote, rejected old maid, the bad mother, the, quote, happy bunny bride, the totaled woman, are all interconnected, implanted fears that can be silenced only when women dare to see the connections among them and to see/name ourselves. Overcoming the silencing of women is an extreme act, a sequence of extreme acts. Breaking our silence means living in existential courage. It means discovering our deep sources, our spring. It means finding our native resiliency, springing into life, speech, action. Many years ago, Rachel Carson published her book, Silent Spring. She was an early prophet foretelling ecological disaster. Her book was greeted with noise and babble, but despite the awards and praise, essentially it received the silent treatment. Like the mythical Cassandra, who was cursed by Apollo, aside the god of truth, to be disbelieved when she prophesied truth, Rachel Carson, whose credibility was weakened by her sex, was greeted with superficial attention and deep inattentiveness. Ecologists today still deny her recognition, maintaining dishonest silence. Meanwhile, the springs are becoming more silent as the necrophilic leaders of phallotechnic society are carrying out their programs of planned poisoning for all life on the planet. I am not suggesting that women have a, quote, mission to save the world from ecological disaster. I am certainly not calling for female self-sacrifice in the male-led cause of ecology, quote, ecology. I am affirming that those women who have the courage to break the silence within ourselves are finding/creating/spiraling a new spring. This spring within and among us makes being possible, makes the process of integrity possible, for it puts us in touch with the intuition of being, which Jan Raymond has called the intuition of integrity. This intuitive, dynamic integrity enables us to begin seeing through the mad reversals which have been our mind bindings. It empowers us to question the sacred and secular, quote, texts which have numbed our brains by implanting, quote, answers before we had a chance to question and to quest. Our discovery of the spring within us enables us to begin asking the right questions. There is no other way to begin. The hope which springs when women's deep silence, the silence that breaks us, is broken, is the hope of saving ourselves, of delivering ourselves from the sins of the fathers and moving on from there. Since this spring of women's being is powerfully attractive to our own kind, womankind, we communicate it even without trying. Thus, by breaking the imposed silence, we help to spring other prisoners of patriarchy whose biophilic tendencies have not been completely blighted and blocked. The point is not to save society or to focus on escape, which is backward-looking, but to release the spring of being. To the inhabitants of Babel, this spring of living speech will be unintelligible. If it is heard at all, it will be dismissed as mere babble, as the muttering of mad crones. So much the better for the crones' chorus. Left undisturbed, we are free to find our own concordance, to hear our own harmony, the harmony of the spheres. The purpose, the method, the style of this book. Writing this book is participating in feminist process. This is problematic. For isn't a book by its definition a, quote, thing, an objectification of thinking, imagining, speaking? Here is a book in my hands, fixed, solid. Perhaps, hopefully, its author no longer wholly agrees with it. It is, at least partially, her past. The dilemma of the living, verbing writer is real, but much of the problem resides in the way books are perceived. If they are perceived/used/idolized as sacred texts like the Bible or the writings of Chairman Mao, then of course the idolaters are caught on a wheel that turns but does not move. They, quote, spin like wheels on ice, a, quote, spinning that in no way resembles feminist process. We cannot avoid this static kind of, quote, spinning wheel, end quote, by becoming anti-literate, anti-cerebral. Quote, feminist anti-intellectualism is a mere reaction against modernizing masculinist education and scholarship, and it is a trap. We need creative crystallizing in the sense of producing works, such as books. Like crystal balls, glowing globes, these help us to foretell the future and to discover the past, for they further the process itself by transforming the previously unknown into that which we explicitly know, and therefore can reflect upon, criticize. Thus they spark new visions. This creative crystallizing is a translation of feminist journeying, of our encounters with the unknown, into a chrysalis. This writing / metamorphosing / spinning is itself part of the journey, and the chrysalis, the incarnation of experience in words, is a living, changing reality. It is the transmission of our transitions. Feminist process must become sensible in actions, speech, works of all kinds in order to become. The journey requires the courage to create, that we may learn from lucid criticism, that we may remember the dismembered body of our heritage, that we may stop repeating the same mistakes. Patriarchal erasure of our tradition forces us to relearn what our foresisters knew and to repeat their blunders. The warped mirror image of creative hagiography is standard patriarchal scholarship, which merely researches and recovers, quote, women's history, end quote. Insofar as this book is true to its original impulse, it is a written rebuttal of the right, R-I-T-E, of right, R-I-G-H-T-E, research. It is part of the meta-patriarchal journeying of women. Hopefully, it will not merely, quote, survive as a thing, a noun, but will spin as a verb, as a gynocentric manifestation of the intransitive verb. Elsewhere, I have advocated committing the crime of methodicide, since the methodolatry of patriarchal disciplines kills creative thought. The acceptable, unexceptional, circular reasonings of academics are caricatures of motion. The, quote, products are more often than not a set of distorted mirrors, made to seem plausible through the mechanisms of male bonding. On the boundaries of the male-centered universities, however, there is a flowering of women-centered thinking. Gynocentric method requires not only the murder of misogynistic methods, intellectual and effective exorcism, but also ecstasy, which I have called ludic cerebration. This is, quote, the free play of intuition in our own space, giving rise to thinking that is vigorous, informed, multidimensional, independent, creative, tough, end quote. It arises from the lived experiences of being. Quote, being is the verb that says the dimensions of depth in all verbs, such as intuiting, reasoning, loving, imaging, making, acting, as well as the couraging, hoping, and playing that are always there when one is really living, end quote. She is quoting herself, which I love. That's from The Church in the Second Sex. Gynocentric writing means risking, since the language and style of patriarchal writing simply cannot contain or carry the energy of women's exorcism and ecstasy. In this book, I invent, discover, remember. At times, I make up words such as gynesthesia for women's synesthesia. Often I unmask deceptive words by dividing them and employing alternate meanings for prefixes. For example, recover actually says cover again. I also unmask their hidden reversals, often by using less known or, quote, obsolete meanings. For example, glamour as used to name a witch's power. Sometimes I simply invite the reader to listen to words in a different way. For example, delight. When I play with words, I do this attentively, deeply. paying attention to etymology, to varied dimensions of meaning, to deep background meanings and subliminal associations. There are some woman-made words which I choose not to use for various reasons. Sometimes I reject words that I think are inauthentic, obscuring women's existence and masking the condition of our oppression. For example, chairperson. The term chairperson does not disclose the sexual identity of the, quote, person. The solution to the problem represented by this word's inadequacy does not lie in the direction of regressing to the pseudo-generic chairman. Rather, hags, if we are interested in, quote, chairs at all, will be specific. A hag holding a chair is a chairwoman or a chair crone. Males can be chairpersons or chairmen. It doesn't matter. In other cases, my choice is a matter of intuitive judgment. For example, my decision not to use her story. Footnote, I prefer the power of the term prehistory to name the prior importance of the interconnected, significant events of women's living and dying. Her story, I think, short-circuits the intent of radical feminism by implying a desire to parallel the record of men's achievements. It fails because it imitates male history. Inherently, it has a, quote, odor of mere reactive maneuvering, which is humiliating to women. It conveys an image of history's junior partner. The point is not simply that this term is, quote, etymologically incorrect, end quote. It is enlightening to compare this term with such women-made constructs as manipulated or the/rapist therapist, which are also, quote, incorrect, but do succeed in targeting/humiliating the right object, end footnote. At times, I have been conscious of breaking almost into incantations, chants, alliterative lyrics. At such moments, the words themselves seem to have a life of their own. They seem to want to break the bonds of conventional usage, to break the silence imposed upon their own backgrounds. They become palpable, powerful, and it seems that they are tired of allowing me to, quote, use them and cry out for a role reversal. Footnote, they appear also to want to break the silence of silent reading, demanding to be read aloud. Aha! Attentive journeyers of this book will notice that this is most likely to happen in the course of the first and third passages. End footnote. I become their mouthpiece, and if I am not always accurate in conveying their meanings, that is probably because I haven't yet learned to listen closely enough in the realm of the labyrinthine inner ear. Another delicate area has been the use of pronouns, especially the choice between we and they to refer to women. Elsewhere, I have stressed the importance of the pronoun we and avoided the, quote, objective they. Obviously, there are times when the use of we would be absurd, for example, when referring to the women of ancient Greece. However, there are other instances when I have to play pronoun usage by ear. As the journey progresses and as the extent of the risk of radical feminism becomes more evident, it becomes clear that there are women, including some who would describe themselves as, quote, feminists, with whom I do not feel enough identification to warrant the pronoun we. Sometimes, since the ambiguity about whether to use we or they is not clearly resolvable, there are difficult choices. Since pronouns are profoundly personal and political, they carry powerful messages. Despite the fact that many writers and readers ignore this pronominal power, subliminal clues are transmitted and received. At times, my choice of we or they is a means of realizing my identification with or separation from certain roles and behaviors. At other times, I use these pronouns interchangeably in reference to the same subject out of a sense of balance, which is simply, quote, playing by ear, end quote. My use of capitalization is, quote, irregular, conforming more to my meaning than to standard usage. For example, I consistently capitalize spinster just as one normally capitalizes Amazon. I capitalize lesbian when the word is used in its woman-identified correct sense, but use the lowercase when referring to the male-distorted version reflected in the media. But note, I prefer to reserve the term lesbian to describe women who are women-identified, having rejected false loyalties to men on all levels. The terms gay or female homosexual more accurately describe women who, although they relate genitally to women, give their allegiance to men and male myths, ideologies, styles, practices, institutions, and professions. End footnote. Self is capitalized when I am referring to the authentic center of women's process, while the imposed/internalized false, quote, self, the shell of the self, is in the lowercase. In writing of the deep background, which is the divine depths of the self, I capitalize, while the term foreground, referring to the surface consciousness, generally is not capitalized. I have not created or followed rigid rules about this matter, but simply have tried to convey meanings accurately/forcefully. Thus, when I write state of possession, the capitals are meant to convey that this is not only an individual or internal condition, but a kind of society. At times, I choose not to capitalize when this would be required by standard usage. The reader will see what I mean when she encounters such an expression as the patriarchal God, all lowercase, as contrasted with the Godfather. I have no need to consistently capitalize Christian or God, being much more inclined to capitalize crone and goddess. This is obviously a matter not only of, quote, taste, but of evaluation. I generally do not bother to change proper names which are conventionally capitalized. Thus, I relegate such cases as the terms Apollo, Christ, and Zeus to their conventional uppercases. One could spend too much energy worrying about such matters. As Gertrude Stein remarked, quote, sometimes one feels that Italians should be with a capital and sometimes with a small letter. One can feel like that about almost anything, end quote. I do not generally put the terms feminine or masculine in quotation marks. I use both of these terms to refer to roles/stereotypes/sets of characteristics which are essentially distorted and destructive to the self and to her process and environment. Thus, if the terms feminine and masochist are used synonymously, this has nothing to do with the deep reality of the female self, but with patriarchally imposed self-denying masks. There is also the matter of the use of sources. The primary sources of this book are women's experiences, past and present. Its secondary sources are male author texts from many, quote, fields. I use the latter in various ways. Sometimes I use them to expose their limitations, to display and exorcise their deceptions. Sometimes I use them as springboards. At all times, I am acutely aware that most of these books and articles were written at the expense of women, whose energies were drained and ideas freely and shamelessly taken over. The following, quote, acknowledgments from Edwin Newman's Strictly Speaking are slightly more obvious than the average, but convey the typical situation. Quote, this book is dedicated to my wife and daughter. My wife's contributions have been so many and varied that it is not possible to list them. There would be no book without her. My daughter supplied many suggestions, much encouragement, and through the years, tolerance of my kind of humor above and beyond the call of duty. Jeanette Hopkins provided the impetus for the book and edited it. Carol Bach did the typing and the research, so like all the work. To both of them, my deep thanks. Mary Heathcote was the invaluable copy editor, end quote. As Andrea Collard has said of male authors, he not only copies her ideas, he also holds the copyright. Finally, I must add that in using male sources, at no point have I acted as the position of disciple, quote disciple, citing an authority. I have tried righteously to use the materials available to me under the prevailing conditions, deploring, as scholars should, the necessity for resorting to such secondary resources. Naming the enemy. This will, of course, be called an, quote, anti-male book. Even the most cautious and circumspect feminist writings are described in this way. The cliché is not only unimaginative, but deafeningly deceptive, making real hearing of what radical feminists are saying difficult, at times even for ourselves. Women and our kind, the earth, the sea, the sky, are the real but unacknowledged objects of attack, victimized as the enemy of patriarchy, of all its wars, of all its professions. There are feminist works which provide abundant examples of misogynistic statements from authorities in all, quote, fields, in all major societies, throughout the millennia of patriarchy. Feminists have also written at length about the actual rapist behaviors of professionals, from soldiers to gynecologists. The, quote, custom of widow burning, sati, in India, the Chinese ritual of foot binding, the genital mutilation of young girls in Africa, still practiced in parts of 26 countries of Africa and actually every single continent on Earth. Maybe not Antarctica. The massacre of women as witches in, quote, Renaissance Europe. Gynocide under the guise of American gynecology and psychotherapy. All are documented facts accessible in the tomes and tombs, aside libraries, of patriarchal scholarship. The contemporary facts of brutal gang rape, of wife beating, of overt and subliminal psychic lobotomizing, all are available. What then can the label anti-male possibly mean when applied to works that expose the facts and invite women to free ourselves? The fact is that the labelers do not intend to convey a rational meaning, nor to elicit a thinking process, but rather to block thinking. They do intend the label to carry a deep emotive message, triggering implanted fears of all the fathers and sons, freezing our minds. For to write a, quote, anti-male book is to utter the ultimate blasphemy. Thus, women continue to be intimidated by the label anti-male. Some feel a false need to draw distinctions. For example, begin, quote, I am anti-patriarchal, but not anti-male, end quote. The courage to be logical, the courage to name, would require that we admit to ourselves that males and males only are the originators, planners, controllers, and legitimators of patriarchy. Patriarchy is the homeland of males. It is the fatherland, and men are its agents. The primary resistance to consciousness of this reality is precisely described in Sisterhood is Powerful. Begin, quote, thinking that our man is the exception, and therefore we are the exception among women, end quote. It is in the interest of men, as men in patriarchy perceive their interest, and in a superficial but self-destructive way of many women, to hide this fact, especially from themselves. The use of the label is an indication of intellectual and moral limitations. Despite all the evidence that women are attacked as projections of the enemy, the accusers ask sardonically, begin, quote, do you really think that men are the enemy, end quote. Yes. Who else? This deception/reversal is so deep that women, even feminists, are intimidated into self-deception, becoming the only self-described oppressed who are unable to name their oppressor, referring instead to vague, quote, forces, quote, roles, quote, stereotypes, quote, constraints, quote, attitudes, quote, influences. This list could go on. The point is that no agent is named, only abstractions. The fact is that we live in a profoundly anti-female society, a misogynistic, quote, civilization in which men collectively victimize women, attacking us as personifications of their own paranoid fears as the enemy. Within this society, it is men who rape, who sap women's energy, who deny women economic and political power. To allow oneself to know and name these facts is to commit anti-gynocidal acts. Acting in this way, moving through the mazes of the anti-female society, requires naming and overcoming the obstacles constructed by its male agents and token female instruments. As a creative crystallizing of the movement beyond the state of patriarchal paralysis, this book is an act of dispossession, and hence, in a sense, beyond the limitations of the label anti-male, it is absolutely anti-androcrat, amazingly anti-male, furiously and finally female. Love it, love it, love it. All right, we're meta anti-male. So good. Okay. The chart of this voyaging/writing. In traditional accounts, Eastern and Western, of the otherworld journey, there are gates through which the soul must pass. The soul is obliged to say the correct words in order to pass the wardens at each passage. I have already suggested that in women's metapatriarchal otherworld journeying, the wardens are the demonic powers of patriarchy, which assume ghostly forms, that is, are difficult to perceive and function as noxious gases. Women who are able to name ourselves are thereby empowered to name the demons at each passage. When we say their names, they, in effect, drop dead. To put it another way, the gases drop down, condense into a merely messy puddle. These warden demons can be seen as personifications of the 8 deadly sins of the fathers. It is significant that in the traditional listing of the, quote, deadly sins, deception is not usually named. This non-naming is an indicator of the pervasive deceptiveness of male-constructed, quote, morality, which does not name its own primary deadly sin. Deception is in fact all-pervasive. It keeps us running in senseless circles. It sedates and seduces ourselves, freezing and fixing female process, enabling the fathers to feed upon women's stolen energy. The paternal parasites hide their vampirizing of female energy by deceptive posturing, which takes the form of processions, religious, military, judicial, academic, etc. For this reason, I choose to use the term processions to name the deception of the fathers. At every turn, the voyagers of this book encounter processions of demons wearing multiform masks. We exorcise them, expelling their deceptions from our minds, ousting these obstacles to our ecstatic process. Processions both display and disguise the deadly sins of the fathers. The deception they engender glues the sins into conglomerates, reversing them, representing them as virtues. The following list, which not accidentally may resemble a sort of incantation, is a new naming of the eight deadly sins of the fathers. Although any listing is necessarily linear, it is clear that these malfunctions, are interconnected, that they feed into each other. First, processions. The basic sin of phallocracy is deception, the destruction of process through patriarchal processions, which are frozen mirror images of spinning process. Professions. Deadly pride is epitomized in patriarchal professions, which condense the process of knowing into an inert and mystifying thing, quote, the body of knowledge, end quote. Possession. Andocratic avarice is demonic possession of female spirit and energy, accomplished not only through political and economic means, but more deeply through male myths. Aggression, the malevolence of male violence, which is, in fact, usually dispassionate,
is misnamed anger, masking the fact that women are the enemy against whom all patriarchal wars are waged, and muting righteous female anger. Obsession. Male lust specializes in genital fixation and fetishism, reflecting a broken integrity of consciousness, generating masculine and feminine role constructs legitimated by pseudo-spiritual religion. Assimilation. Gynocidal gluttony expresses itself in vampirism/cannibalism, feeding upon the living flesh, blood, spirit of women, while tokenism disguises the devastation of the victims. Elimination. Misogynist envy tends inherently toward the elimination of all self-identified women, accomplishing this end through the reconception/reforming of some women into Athena-like accomplices. And finally, fragmentation. Patriarchal sloth has enslaved women, whose creativity is confined by mandatory menial labor and by deceptively glorified subservient social activities, resulting in, quote, busy and enforced feminine sloth. Each of these sins of the fathers is more than a sum of abstractions. Each is incarnated in the institutions of patriarchy and in those who invent, control, and legitimate these institutions. Thus, women's journeying of self-centering becoming, passing through the, quote, gates of God, end quote, which block us from our own background, means confronting these deceptive incarnations/demons, naming them and naming their games. Our journeying past these watchful wardens is not linear. Amazing their mazes involves spinning through them at multiple times in multiple ways. Since their names are legion, there is not one simple once and for all name for the demons. Their lecherous litanies are like passages of unholy scripture, which they repeat over and over again, and which have many levels of deception, not perceptible all at once. They become more perceptible as we learn to name ourselves, become ourselves more adequately. Concomitant with the amazing struggle, which is exorcism, is the ecstatic process of spinsters discovering the labyrinth of our own unfolding/becoming. Passing through the male-made mazes is not simply a preliminary lap of the journey. It makes way for and accompanies the ecstatic labyrinthine journey of survivors. In this book, I will chart/describe this amazing and spinning voyage. That is, I will write about fundamental, quote, blind alleys, end quote, of the master's maze, which hide the passages of the labyrinthine way of ecstasy. I will be concerned with discovering the Father's processions and with breaking away from them. The voyage will involve encounters with the other 7 deadly sins/demons as well. These encounters are recurrent and in random order as the demons appear and reappear at various points, attempting to block our way. The voyage of this book moves through 3 passages. As the terrain changes, so also does the style of the explorer, her movement, her language. In the first passage, there is an exuberance of discovery as the voyager breaks through the barriers of obsolete myths which block vision. There is the constant surprise of seeing what is on the other side of the hill and on all sides as the scope of vision broadens and deepens. In the second passage, there is a soberness and focused attention as the explorer encounters the unnatural enemies of female being in their multiple postures of indecent exposure. There is a focused intensity as she marks the snares laid by the deadly game trappers, analyzing the archetypal atrocities in order to unmask the lethal intent of the death dealers. In the third passage, having perceived the intent of the gynocidal gamesters, she moves deeper into the other world, which is her own time-space. Her style reflects her newfound capacity to recognize their intent in its seemingly innocent and chillingly familiar manifestations. Their chivalry, their help, their care, their art, their romance, their respect, their rewards, their blessings, their love. This new knowing, her beatific vision, encourages her to invent new modes of being/speaking, which are spooking, sparking, spinning. My charting and describing are inspired by many four sisters. Since all who have embarked on this journey are, quote, contemporaries in the only sense that matters, the century or span of decades measured by patriarchal time in which, quote, his history places each of us is far less relevant than our own network of communication. All women who define our own living, defying the deception of patriarchal history, are journeying. We belong to the same time, and we are four sisters to each other. Ah, beautiful. Here in this volume, my charting and describing is inspired in a particular way by the words of one four-sister, Virginia Woolf, who in her profoundly anti-patriarchal book, 3 Guineas, asks, begin quote, "What are these ceremonies, and why should we take part in them? What are these professions, and why should we make money out of them? Where, in short, is it leading us, the procession of the sons of educated men?" End quote. In this prophetic book, published in the 1930s, she shows connections among the absurd professional processions, displaying their deception, their morbidity and meaninglessness. She advises us to, quote, break the ring, the vicious circle, the dance round and round the mulberry tree, the poison tree of intellectual harlotry, end quote. The circle of processions and of professions is linked to possession. Of women's dilemma, she writes, begin quote, "Behind us lies the patriarchal system, the private house with its nullity, its immorality, its hypocrisy, its servility. Before us lies the public world, the professional system, with its possessiveness, its jealousy, its pugnacity, its greed. The one shuts us up like slaves in a harem. The other forces us to circle, like caterpillars head to tail, round and round the mulberry tree, the sacred tree of property. It is a choice of evils. Each is bad," end quote. Yes, and each is part of the same system of patriarchal possession, whose primary property is female life. The writing/journeying of this book passes/spins through the phallocratic maze. Yet the other side of this other world journeying is discovered at every turn. This is the ecstatic side. It involves speaking in various modes, spooking, sparking, spinning. Although there is no, quote, one-to-one correlation between the exorcising and the ecstatic movements, there is a kind of moving pattern, a spiraling of counterparts, a harmony of hearing and speaking. Our acts of exorcism are rites of passage, by which we win the rites of passage. Rites, the second time being R-I-G-H-T. And the first time, R-I-T-E. So our acts of exercising are R-I-T-E-S, rites of passage, by which we win the R-I-G-H-T-S, rites of passage. In the process of encountering and naming the male factors who freeze process into processions, hoard knowing within professions, and kill creativity by possession, I point out clues which, as they are recognized, disclose the living process which has been hidden, caricatured, captured, stunted, but never completely killed by the phallocentric sins. These clues point to a force which is beyond, behind, beneath the patriarchal death march, an unquenchable gynergy. They serve as raw material for a process of alchemy. We transmute the base metals of man-made myth by becoming unmute, calling forth from ourselves and each other the courage to name the unnameable. End chapter. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe. That's it. Thanks. See you next time.